Okay guys, welcome to this week's home group tutorial. Here I am on a Sunday afternoon back in my study, having preached this morning on Samson. And today we're thinking about strengths and weaknesses, because Samson was someone who was equipped by God to lead the Israelites against the Philistines. He was a man's man, he was strong, he was intimidating, he was the sort of person that people will follow. And yet he had this glaring weakness, and his weakness was, as I said in my sermon, really fueled by testosterone, and it was mostly around women. He had a weakness with women, and he ended up telling his secret to Delilah and losing his God-given gift and ending his life in a pretty sad way, although he had one last moment where he was able to push down the pillars holding up the roof of the building, the temple that the Philistines were worshipping in, and killed more people in his own death than he'd killed during his life. But I think the lesson out of Samson's story for us this week is strengths and weaknesses, how we deal with them. So the first question that I've got for you is, how can we discover our strengths and weaknesses, and how important is it that we know what our strengths and weaknesses are? And I've got a reading there from 1 Corinthians 12 talking about spiritual gifts, and also from Psalm 51, where David was convicted of his own weakness with Bathsheba, and then he said that his sin was ever before him. So knowing what our strengths and weaknesses are, how do we know that? How important is it? The second question, how do we develop our strengths? And we've all got God-given gifts, we're told. The Bible tells us every Christian has at least one gift. So how do we discover that gift? How do we develop it? And the scripture there that I've given you is Paul encouraging Timothy, the young guy starting out in ministry, to fan into flame his gift. How do we do that? Third question, how do we manage our weaknesses? And our weaknesses can trip us up. We can achieve a lot of good with our strengths, but one bad moment with our weaknesses can undo years of good with our strengths. So how do we manage our weaknesses? And we're looking there at what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount about if your eye causes you to sin, then gouge it out. Put some boundaries in your life. What sort of boundaries can we put around our weaknesses so that we don't just rely on willpower, which in the heat of the moment in temptation can and does let us down? How do we try to remove some of that temptation from our life so we don't put ourselves at risk? The fourth question is how do we recover from failure? We all fail, and we all then are racked with shame, and perhaps a discussion around the difference between shame and guilt. Shame says that I'm no good. Guilt says that I've done something wrong, but I can recover from it. Perhaps you could discuss the difference between shame and guilt and recovering from failure. And then the last question, how do we turn our weakness into strength? Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh and how he prayed for God to take the thorn in the flesh away, but God chose not to and said, I can work my strength through your weakness. So how does that work in reality? How can we allow Jesus Christ, through the power of his Spirit, to turn our own weaknesses into a strength, where we really see that that God is working to help us overcome a weakness in our life that has tripped us up in the past? And perhaps you could talk about an example of how God might have helped you to find strength in an area where you've been weak. And just quickly, as an example, which I didn't use in my sermon, I said that one of my weaknesses is being a people pleaser. And recently I was asked to take part in a meeting, an online meeting, which was going to be every week on a Thursday morning at 6 a.m. I was feeling quite a lot of pressure and feeling coerced to be part of this meeting, which I'd never really said that I would. And I prayed about it. And then I said to the people, I'm sorry, but I can't be part of that meeting. It's just adding another layer of commitment to my life, which I can't actually handle at the moment. And I felt such a sense of achievement to be able to find some strength in an area where I would normally have said, oh, okay, I'll be part of the meeting even though I didn't want to be part of the meeting. So you might be able to discuss some examples like that. Have a great study and just talk a lot about your strengths and weaknesses this week.